Joker is good. It's good, good, good. It's so good, I dress like this, despite the fact you will take me 30% less seriously for having dressed as the Joker for Halloween. And no, I am not going to sit here and tell you that you have to like Joker. I don't think that. But oh boy, is it ever good. It's so good. There's so many people that like this film. So many have seen it that right-wing people are trying to claim the film. And they're so wrong about the film, it doesn't even deserve addressing. Let's just say their brains are in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level ideas. More importantly, I think that a lot of criticism of the film, not all of it, most of it, is ideological performance, whether the critics doing it know it or not. So there, I basically stated a thesis. Might as well do title cards too. And you know what that means? People are gonna say it's my best video by far. Yeah! So you're gonna watch to the end, otherwise you're gonna shut your damn mouth and watch something else. I should also give a warning that I'm gonna spoil aspects of the film, and I'm tired of pretending that it isn't funny!
When we meet Arthur Fleck, he's on the job as a clown and some diverse kids beat him up. Given that this is intended to look like a movie from the late 70s, early 80s, this is an obvious allusion to a right-wing trope that either people of a lower class or, gasp, of a different race are wild, untamed.
If this were basically any film from the era this film depicts, it would be code for, wow, you are right about that secret distrust of poor people and black people. But it's not a film from that era, it's a film about now. Right here, it makes this explicit when a coworker calls the kids animals and savages, and the film's title character repudiates this attempt to dehumanize them by saying they are just kids. This is, of course, pretty anachronistic. It's not really something that would have been said in the context of a 70s or 80s film, and also it's exactly goddamn right, they are just kids.
Kids in a world of ruthless ideology likely presented to them with ideas like only the strong survive.
Demanding performance of strength at all times. No muscle at all there. Joker's been eating a few too many waffles.
A clown is a symbol that contradicts this. The kind of clown Arthur is paid to be is supposedly carefree and uninhibited, meaning he's paid to perform something no one in the film's world actually is. The cruel ideology of the film's world demands no one tolerate or aspire to this. Harassment and assault of Arthur as he fakes happiness for a wage is a pretty perfect expression of this reality. Arthur is far removed from this society. He doesn't belong, he doesn't function. Everything about his life is, well, trash, born from various forms of abuse, both societal and personal, which we learn about more over the course of the film. Arthur is also mentally ill and therefore a person society views as a pressure release valve. Following that logic, he loses his job after making a negligent decision and is unable to justify himself to his employer. Arthur is on a downward trajectory.
I believe this film is about, above everything else, a rising class consciousness in a world of ideology. That ideology is, of course, the harsh austerity of capitalism and/or neoliberalism.
At the beginning of the film, we have the downtrodden Arthur Fleck, and at the end, we have the Joker, a villain. And I think the transformation is symbolic of something a little bit different than the media reaction has indicated.
Joker is not about easy answers. It doesn't accept societal narratives of different types of people.
For instance, some have presented Arthur's social worker, a black woman, as little more than an impediment or obstacle to Arthur. I call bullshit on that, though, as one must consider who this woman actually is. Someone working a so-so job they would have had to get a bachelor's degree to get, something that would have been more difficult for a black woman given social prejudices against, well, black people and women. She's most likely worked very hard for her entire life to get into what has very recently shown itself to be a dead-end job, and the dead end much closer as the city cut the budget. And she's also the one who delivers the message of class consciousness to Arthur. They don't give a shit about people like you, Arthur, and they don't give a shit about people like me either. By the time she says this, however, it feels too late for him to take it particularly seriously. You see, Arthur has killed 3 people. The act started as self-defense, but quickly became a cathartic expression of the ideology the world has been working so hard to drill into his head. Competition to survive in an exploitative, uncaring world. What he saw in these Wall Street bros he killed are the people who have won the game he's been losing his whole life, so he decides to win. The release he feels from this event is more satisfying to him, more validating of him than the somewhat pessimistic message of struggle his social worker presents. I'm sure he technically agrees with her statement. I hardly think Arthur entertains the idea the world cares about him, but he doesn't agree with the implications of the statement. He doesn't see the potential for alliance, nor does he understand who is his foe. She presented him with the ideology-revealing sunglasses from They Live, and he rejected them. More on that later.
The minute Joker was announced, liberal critics rejected the film, believing it to be dangerous, and having been created for manosphere types, eventually specifically incels, once that term became a signifier of one's cultural literacy, one's understanding of
the culture war. In 1991, James Davidson Hunter published a book entitled Culture Wars: The Struggle to Define America, in which he describes a transformation he perceived in the United States politics and culture. Instead of a struggle informed by some method of structural analysis, the primary political clashes he observed were issue-specific. These, of course, are important things, such as reproductive rights, drug use, immigration, sexuality, gender, and censorship. The list goes on infinitely, as the world is full of problems that need solving, to say the least. The culture war is essentially the partisan division regarding popular opinion on these issues, and it probably sounds pretty familiar. That's because it's essentially the institutionalized mode of American politics. Andrew Breitbart, founder of Breitbart News, a far-right media outlet known to post outright false information, understood the culture war better than most. The way that you're going to change politics is by changing the popular culture. Barack Obama won not because of a series of ideas he offered to the American people, he offered popular culture. He had the weight and the tidal wave of popular culture behind him. Now, here's the thing about this. Barack Obama is, just as Andrew Breitbart was, pro-capitalism. The differences between these two people's viewpoints are not about which socioeconomic system is acceptable, but rather how to maintain the current system and what is permissible within it. This is the culture war, the segmenting of issues which are otherwise systemically connected and assigning them to political teams whose differentiating factor is restricted to answering yes or no, left or right, when asked if they support those issues. The woke team, liberals, or the broke team, conservatives, so to speak. To assert a critique of power structure, a need for connection and class consciousness, or even just to say that every so-called social issue has an economic aspect of it, is to work outside the frame of the culture war. And to work that way is a threat to the system both so-called sides accept, even if a small one.
These are two warring factions in a managerial class, and Joker is an artistic criticism of the driving ideology both the woke team and the broke team subscribe to. Capitalism! Its depiction is, by necessity, a little more brutal and blunt. Obviously, the events of the film have to make sense, and we don't all become Joker despite how shit things are in real life. But the ideology of the film is basically our world's turned up to 11. There is a big difference in approach as to how each team rejects the core criticism of a subversive work, however. The broke team generally looks to discuss and integrate the aesthetics of a subversive work, taking advantage of something that people like. This is called recuperation. It's essentially institutionalized power, healing the wounds a subversive work has inflicted upon it. We've discussed that on this channel so many times it's not even funny, perhaps the most prominently in episode 20, Taking the Red Pill Back. The woke team, on the other hand, generally thinks that it should first try to criticize a thing out of existence, and if that doesn't work, they attempt to ignore it completely. That isn't to say that the woke team doesn't work to recuperate things. If they see the aesthetic of social justice in a work that is critical of the system which creates social injustice, they will seek to adopt that work in ways that don't threaten their place in society. Joker does not take on the aesthetic of social justice. Instead, it takes on the aesthetic of a Scorsese film. one in which the villain is the protagonist. By the way, somewhere along the road, good representation fetishists decided that protagonist means good guy, self-insert character, which is why, intentionally or not, some liberal members of the press saw the film at the Venice Film Festival and had to ignore the obvious implications of class struggle in order to focus on how the film makes us sympathize with the incel protagonist. Incels are a pretty hot culture war topic, and perhaps one of the better examples of it. An incel is defined as someone who is involuntarily celibate, someone who wants to bang but doesn't. And here's the thing. If one wants to actually analyze incels, there's much more to them than that. Incels are one of the most pure expressions of alienation in contemporary society. Many factors, both social and economic, as dictated by the parlance of our times, contribute to their position. Something incels are known for is their misogyny and entitlement, but people tend to ignore that these things come from an incredibly skewed view of the world informed by ideology. Actually, the same ideology I believe Joker is ultimately criticizing. I talked more about alienation in episode 12, Somewhere to Belong, in case you happen to be more interested in that, but in the context of the culture war, all systemic causes are stripped from what an incel is. In the culture war, an incel is simply another broke team adjacent outgroup, and is, as I said earlier, a great new word which signifies an understanding of culture. Which, by the way, is exactly why I think the film had to be categorized as such by the woke team. It has the potential to reach people who do not express woke signifiers with a message that ultimately asks them to simply exit the stadium where the broke team and the woke team are playing whatever sport it is they're playing metaphorically. Let's say League of Legends. That's a sport, right? First, Joker was an incel folk hero. Then, the film was an incel anthem. And it's always been so violent that it's going to cause a mass shooting over the weekend. Oh my god, it's really gonna happen. Some person who we will give fame and notoriety to, some incel will do a mass shooting for sure. You'll do that, right? Come on, do that, do the shooting, yeah! Mass shooting, baby! The film was associated with misogyny and entitlement, and criticism was skewed on a partisan basis. The broke team did exactly as I mentioned earlier, attempting to take the narrative without caring what the film was about at all.
I believe the film's director, Todd Phillips, sensed an opportunity and indulged the controversy, intentionally stirring up the woke team with a few well-timed jabs in interviews a couple days before the film's release.
He mentioned a few very non-specific cultural signifiers he knew would generate outrage, such as humor is hard now because of woke culture. It worked incredibly well, to be frank. I think Todd is pretty smart, actually. Earlier, I talked about how Arthur's black social worker delivered a message of class consciousness to him, which he rejected in favor of individual catharsis. Well, later in the film, another black mental health worker realized mid-conversation the information he was about to give Arthur would hurt him, and said he would not share the information, which Arthur again rejected in favor of individual catharsis. Through his interactions with these two people who present more emotionally intelligent paths for Arthur, which he ultimately ignores, the film is kind of acknowledging that if Joker were black, the film would much more easily be ignored itself. Black films about class consciousness often have the exact same thing happen to them. You don't have to try to brand them as incel propaganda to get people to be like, oh, you just call them black art, or diverse art, or confusing. In fact, we'll go ahead and talk way more about how film reviewers ignore subversive messages in a moment. But before we do, in an interview, Todd has called Joker a way to sneak a real movie into the studio system under the guise of a comic book film. And that makes me think he has the savvy to try to manipulate public outrage, which he has called a commodity. And I mean, no one I know of has ever said similar stuff in a ton of videos over a several-year span, including a 49-minute documentary entitled The Outrage or anything like that. In his 1967 book, Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord said the following.
When analyzing the spectacle, one speaks, to some extent, the language of the spectacular itself, in the sense that one moves through the methodological terrain of the very society which expresses itself through the spectacle.
I think this is key to understanding what Joker exactly is. The spectacle is a mode of social relations among people mediated by images. It's a language of objectification and fetishization, and it is the one spoken by the media. But most importantly, it is a passive method of total control. Again, this is the culture war. The right wing tries to make the popular film about what their version of capitalist ideology tells them, and the liberal wing does the same. In my opinion, Todd completely gets this concept and used it to get his movie seen. In fact, Todd is fluent enough in the spectacle that it's basically how he got to make what he calls a real movie. He accessed the pop culture and subverted it to his own will. I'm not asserting he's definitely a good and pure anti-capitalist freedom fighter, one of us, or whatever. I don't know. I certainly like and respect what he's done here, though. I'd love to talk to him, pick his brain about the film, but I'm also a bit of a dipshit.
What I'm asserting is that the culture war is basically a thing used to refocus, defang, and commodify outrage about highly specific fetishizations of real-life issues. And that people with real concerns that relate to these fetishizations should take a page out of Todd's book, learn to speak spectacular language, and subvert it. Warner and DC didn't suddenly think they needed to make a film to validate incels. They want to make money. The hyper-specific idea of incels don't make up such a significant demographic you'd spend $65 million to make a film for them. I mean, that's not the biggest budget ever, but we're not talking about tens of millions of incel moviegoers either. They wanted to make a Joker film that people went to go see.
Todd made a film that gives the capitalists their mid-budget superhero movie, but it also cuts through all the culture war bullshit to say everything is connected and we don't have to tolerate powerful people. When the city cuts the budget, the mentally ill get hurt. When the rich exploit the poor become disillusioned. When you, yourself, cut through all the hype and accept that the protagonist can be a villain, in fact, can be the villain, and that character development isn't always positive, you may find what I consider to be the best expression of the result of the ideology this film aims to criticize. The Joker himself. I called specific attention to the scene in which Arthur's social worker says, "They don't give a shit about people like you, Arthur. They don't give a shit about people like me either." Because I think this is an even more pivotal moment for Arthur than when he kills the Wall Street guys. Specifically because these moments aren't that far apart. The implication his social worker made is that the injustices of their world make up a shared struggle rather than an individual one. However, Arthur does not accept it as one. Arthur doesn't put on the ideology-revealing sunglasses. His viewpoint and actions instead continue to be driven by the justifying ideology of the film's world.
They Live from 1988 is definitely one of the forgotten masterpieces of the Hollywood left. It tells the story of John Nada, a homeless worker in LA who, drifting around, one day enters into an abandoned church and finds there a strange box full of sunglasses. And when he put one of them on, walking along the LA streets, he discovers that these glasses function like critique of ideology. They allow you to see the real message beneath all the propaganda, publicity, glitz, posters, and so on. It's the invisible order which sustains your apparent freedom. To step out of ideology, it hurts. It's a painful experience. You must force yourself to do it. This is rendered in a wonderful way with a further scene in the film where John Nada tries to force his best friend, John Armitage, to also put the glasses on.
I don't want to fight you. Come on. I don't want to fight you. Stop it. No!
And it's the weirdest scene in the film. The fight takes 8-9 minutes.
Put on the glasses.
It may appear irrational, because why does this guy reject so violently to put the glasses on? It is as if he is well aware that spontaneously he lives in a lie, that the glasses will make him see the truth, but that this truth can be painful, can shatter many of your illusions. This is a paradox we have to accept.
Put the glasses on! Put them on!
The extreme violence of liberation. You must be forced to be free. If you trust simply your spontaneous sense of well-being or whatever, you will never get free.
What?
Freedom hurts.
In the scene with the social worker, Arthur does the same thing that many critics of films that tread close to criticizing the ideological justifications for their place in the social hierarchy also do. The media pundit class tends to describe movies like Sorry to Bother You 2018, for instance, as unclear.
One review said it helps when making a satire for the filmmakers to clearly define and develop the subject to be ridiculed.
2019's Us was a brilliant film with themes that actually aren't that far from Joker's, which were somehow invisible to many in the pundit class.
From one of the reviews, calling Us a disappointment is an oversimplification. It's more of an incomplete thought. The more you think about Us, the more it unravels.
My personal favorite example to use is 2017's Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, where the film was almost unanimously praised, by critics anyways. A small vocal element of the fan base and their Rotten Tomato fanbots pretty loudly disagreed, but despite that, the film has a standing 91% critic rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and oddly enough, almost every single review is somehow critical of the 11-minute Canto Bight casino sequence. You know, the one that paints capitalism, imperialism, and war not only as the problem, but unequivocally connected to each other.
Outlets who otherwise published praise of the film said things like it was roundabout and ultimately pointless. An article in the Washington Post said, "It's really worth taking a moment just to see how spectacularly this plot goes wrong. This diversion literally ends up having no impact on the plot at all." It's also not restricted to movies. Again, the Washington Post described the very obviously capitalism-critical game The Outer Worlds as taking place in a post-capitalist society where megacorporations not only run everything, but have created planetary fandoms akin to Beyoncé worship, all the while exploiting workers for corporate gain. That hypothetical world is nothing like ours, right? It must be a different, nameless, definitely comes after capitalism type system.
These articles contain a byproduct of rejecting the ideology classes, which can happen due to a variety of motives, by the way. It can be the ignorance of affluence, it can be a lack of willingness to critically engage with one's own position in society, or it can be a total lack of incentive. After all, the incentive of a person in a position of comfort is to preserve that comfort, not to totally invalidate it. And here's the thing, no one really wants to be part of the problem. So many in positions of consequence build beliefs that excuse themselves. The anti-rich sentiment Arthur Fleck's action stokes in Gotham further rises as Thomas Wayne, billionaire candidate for mayor, calls discontents clowns. A movement forms, but Arthur does not join it. In fact, Arthur never really talks to anyone involved in any political action. He's shown watching the protests and riots multiple times, smiling and enjoying it, but never talking to a person. By the time he goes on Murray Franklin, he's embraced the ideology of the world around him, an austerity-centric, neoliberal capitalism. He goes on about people's lack of civility, as if that's somehow the problem, despite him living the harsh reality of the actual problem. He claims not to be political, perhaps the most glaring tell of someone who is comfortable with their own status quo while airing his personal grievances to an audience that's actually listening for the first time. He's concerned with nothing outside of himself and utterly consumed with his own catharsis. So in other words, he's winning. The Joker is not rebelling against society by the end of the film. Instead, he himself is the ultimate expression of the prevailing ideology of the world around him. And he's a villain. He dominates an absolutely huge number of best villain lists, and will continue to for the foreseeable future. Joker has never been a working class savior, not even one time since his introduction in 1940, and he never will be. The clown movement of the film love their image of him, the spectacle of the Joker, but they don't know him. The Joker's just some guy who gets wrapped up in competitive, individualistic ideology that the world presents him, and he takes it to an extreme. I am 95% sure the joke he's laughing at in the final moments of the film, the one that his therapist wouldn't get, is that the thing that inspired people to band together and fight back was some dude who dressed up like a clown and sought his own catharsis. The Joker rings true in real life, too. As people band together and fight back against the austerity of neoliberal capitalist regimes all around our world, this clown keeps showing up. But while the crowds reject the way society has worked out for them, Joker joins it.
Now, there is some ambiguity over whether or not Arthur Fleck is real in the world of the film and whether or not any of it really happened. Either way, Joker views it all as, well, a joke. He says, "I used to think my life was a tragedy, but now I realize it's a comedy." Putting it simply, a tragedy is a story where the ending is sad, while comedy is one where the ending is happy. At this point, Arthur might as well be talking directly to the camera. He's telling us what kind of story we're watching. But here's the thing. Obviously, a story which ends with a bunch of murders is not, at least logically speaking, happy. So how could the ending be happy? For me, it's about perspective.
The ending is happy from the perspective of Arthur. The story is a chain of events that leads to his catharsis and validation in a world no one would want to live. If, as I think Arthur joined this ruthless society, then I think the point is, this is a happy ending, not just in this absolutely terrible world, but also according to this absolutely terrible world. The overall criticism the film makes, then, isn't too convoluted or weird. However, a lot of people overlook it, I think, because it's made through description rather than prescription. The audience is asked to consider whether we accept or reject the ideology of the world of this film while asking ourselves how similar to our own world is it. To do this, it depicts elements of our world hyperbolically and with very specific context, expecting the viewer to either consciously or subconsciously engage with that context. I'd also argue that the film wants us to reject it, to change it, as it paints the eventual retaliation of increasing systemic violence to be, well, more violence. Disturbing, hyper-real violence meant to have an impact. I guess the director of the film hopes our world would never get as bad as the one in the film, but in a lot of ways it kind of is already. Our world is just a lot better at hiding it. Society is full of contradictions. Many around what our culture has taught us is good. These ideas we see around us, inclusion, representation, tolerance, etc., all seem good and, even in my opinion, are good. The issue is, these things are connected to each other and many other things at a systemic level, and if we want to address them for real, we can't just go down the list and make any one of them just go away on its own. It is a web, and at the center of that web is exploitation. If we dig into these things, we almost can't help but reject the ideology on display. The market doesn't solve the things we're meant to think we can solve through it. That's what cutting the budget does. It hurts people by feeding their problems to the market. It's an act of de-universalization, of putting a price on people's lives, of keeping them under a boot. Other than Gotham being more of a powder keg, the ideology of our world is on display in Joker. Harsh austerity with the intent of either eliminating social services or finding a market solution for them isn't just something that happens in our world, it is the prevailing mode of operation. Of course, Joker became a hot topic in the culture war. If you're on either the broke or the woke team, you have to find a way to talk about a film that's made over $700 million. I mean, people are seeing it. So how do you do that with a film depicting how broken the system is without talking about how broken the system is? Well, again, for conservatives, it's attempting to appropriate the aesthetics just enough that people ignore the message, and for liberals, it's finding a way to use the fact conservatives like it to make it appear bad. And as someone who thinks leftist-informed political struggle is the solution to this kind of neoliberal capitalist hell, I feel people kinda have to speak, to some extent, the language of the spectacular itself. Some level of engagement in the culture war is necessary, but not because of the Breitbart doctrine. The idea that culture changes politics only works for conservatives and liberals because the overall system is compatible with both of their ideas of culture and politics. Their ideas of change simply involve getting or revoking permission to occupy more or less of the hierarchy. The manner a person with an understanding of these dynamics and a goal of changing things systemically might want to engage in the culture war would be like jacking into the Matrix to try to bring people out. Instead of getting mad and being right, instead of individual grievance and catharsis, we can see that many are hurting, and we can offer a hand. There's a strange optimism I felt after going to see this film, which, considering it's a fairly pessimistic film that ends with the creation of a villain, is kind of an interesting thing to happen. It's partly because I think, intuitively, it makes people consider our world in a different way. And we really need to.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope that this video makes more sense than my life, get it? This is the value extraction portion of the video. If you liked it, click the like button, subscribe. Don't forget to click the notification bell, and if you particularly like my channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/PeterCoffin. Thanks again, bye-bye.